They remember me as the scandal, the sister, the rebel, never the heir. But before the cigarettes and the headlines, before the doomed love affairs and press-fueled whispers, I was just Margaret, a child born into a dynasty, too grand to ever feel intimate, yet too suffocating to ever feel free. My story doesn't begin in disgrace. It begins in the nursery, in the echo of polished footsteps on marble floors, in the shadow cast by my older sister, the future queen. We were close, Elizabeth and I, not just by blood, but in spirit. At least, in the early days. She was cautious, composed, always proper. I was the spark, the wildflower in a royal garden that demanded symmetry. They adored my laugh, my charm, the way I could lighten a room, sunlight spilling across cold stone. But I saw it in their eyes. I was never meant to rule. I was meant to decorate. Our father, King George VI, was a gentle soul buried beneath a crown too heavy for his temperament. I loved him fiercely. He read to us, held our hands, called us his pride and joy. Yet even in those tender moments, I could feel the invisible scaffolding of destiny rising around Elizabeth. She was trained in duty. I was indulged in delight. And then the war came. Bombs fell over London like iron rain. And the palace trembled, just as the common homes did. But it wasn't fear that etched itself into my memory. It was relevance. For the first time, we mattered not as figureheads, but as symbols of endurance. I felt it in the shelter when Elizabeth gripped my hand. I wasn't a spare then. I was a sister. But peace has a cruel way of rearranging power. Our uncle, Edward VIII, the man who gave up the throne for love, cast a long, traitorous shadow over our family. We were raised to despise his weakness. I, too, would one day be tested in love, and judged by the same brutal standard. When father died, something in me collapsed. I was 21, young, spirited, and naive enough to believe that the royal court would still see me as Margaret, the individual. But now, Elizabeth was queen. My sister no longer walked beside me. She sat above me. Everything changed. The same men who had chuckled at my jokes now lowered their eyes in her presence. I became Her Majesty's sister. It sounds regal. It isn't. It's a title lined in glass, transparent, reflective, and shatterable. And then came Peter. Captain Peter Townsend. If you want to understand my downfall, if you want to understand the rot beneath the glamour, you must understand him. Because loving Peter was the moment I ceased being a royal and started becoming a cautionary tale. But I didn't see scandal. I saw kindness, maturity. A war hero who spoke softly and carried the kind of dignity no tiara could replicate. He was everything I never found in the aristocrats who puffed their egos with titles and doused their affections in protocol. He was real, steady, 20 years my senior, yes. But in the royal circle, where every decision is drained of emotion and replaced by duty, Peter felt like the only living man in a house full of wax figures. We met when I was barely 20, and he was the king's equerry. A man of fine manners and quiet sorrow. He had survived the war, carried wounds you couldn't see. He had a wife then, and I had the frivolity of youth, but something unspoken tethered us. When his marriage dissolved, I did what no proper royal was supposed to do. I loved him openly. You don't understand what that means, not unless you've lived inside the cage of royalty. Every smile is calculated, every gesture reviewed, but love, real, raw, unapologetic love can't be rehearsed. And when Peter touched my hand in front of palace staff, the whispers ignited, like dry leaves on fire. I was called impulsive, immature, rebellious. They said I was dragging the monarchy into modern shame. But I wasn't dragging the monarchy. I was trying to drag myself out of loneliness. Elizabeth was now queen. Our mother, the Queen Mother, stood firmly against the Union and Parliament. They didn't just disapprove, they forbade. You see, Peter was divorced, and in 1950s Britain, marrying a divorce while in the line of succession was more treasonous than adultery. The church, the cabinet, the crown, all pillars of power conspired not to preserve morality, but to preserve image. They exiled Peter, sent him away to Belgium, made it look like a diplomatic reassignment. It was exile. Let's not pretend otherwise. I remember the day he left. I wasn't in pearls. I wasn't wearing royal blue. I was in tears, behind closed curtains, with a letter in my lap. A letter that would define the next 2 years of my life. We wrote in secret. While Britain crowned Elizabeth, I mourned a man who is still alive. They made me choose, love or duty. Elizabeth offered me an out. If I renounce it, my royal privileges, stepped out of the line of succession, and married Peter as a private citizen, we could be together. That should have been enough. It would be for most people, but it wasn't for me. Because I wasn't just in love. I was born into a curse. My whole identity had been forged in royalty. To walk away from it wasn't a gesture of freedom. It felt like suicide. I would become nothing. No title, no place, no name on the royal roster. I would be a footnote in the archives of Windsor, marked only by scandal. I couldn't do it. And so, I gave up Peter Townsend. The press called it noble. Historians call it regret. I call it the first time I broke my own heart to protect a lie. From that moment on, the girl they once called radiant became the woman they called tragic. But I wasn't done yet. If I couldn't marry for love, I would marry for something else. Anthony Armstrong Jones was everything Peter wasn't. Daring, irreverent, unimpressed by the palace's dusty rituals. He was an artist, a photographer who captured secrets through a lens and carried shadows in his soul. I thought he would rescue me from the suffocating grip of royalty. What I didn't realize was that I wasn't marrying a man, I was marrying a mirror. Anthony reflected back all the rebellion I wanted to feel. He was handsome in that cruel, aristocratic way, with an edge that made him seem untouchable. When he photographed me, I felt seen, not as a princess, but as a woman. A real woman, desired, understood, beautiful in a way the court never acknowledged. We married in 1960, the first royal wedding to be televised. 300 million people watched it, and the newspapers called it a fairy tale. What they didn't show was the cold silence in the car afterward, the way Anthony lit a cigarette and stared out the window as if the entire performance had already bored him. They called him the Earl of Snowdon, but I knew him as the man who could vanish in plain sight. For a while, we worked, or rather, we looked like we worked. The parties were grand, the photographs captivating, the children. David and Sarah were born into a house full of art and drama. But it was never love, not the kind I had tasted and lost. This was survival dressed in designer silk. He had lovers, men, women. The whispers swirled like perfume in the palace halls. I had lovers too, but where his affairs were taken of artistic indulgence, mine were scandal. I was called unfaithful, cold, a drunk. The press didn't care about context, only contrast. The Queen was the picture of restraint. I was the chaos they couldn't look away from. But let me tell you this, betrayal isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's a quiet dinner where your husband doesn't ask how your day was. A party where he forgets you're even there. A marriage where every shared bed feels like borrowed furniture. I learned to drink, to forget, to laugh too loudly, and wear things just a little too daring. I became the headline, the rebel, the disappointment. But none of those were who I was. They were just the roles I played in a palace script I never wrote. By 1976, the marriage was dust. The divorce was the first for a senior royal in over 400 years, another black mark on the family name. But I didn't feel shame, I felt relief, and yet, I was lonelier than ever. They say fame is a spotlight, but I tell you, it's a furnace. And I was burning slowly, surrounded by people who called me Your Royal Highness, but never asked if I was okay. By then, the image of me as a young, dazzling princess had hardened into something else. A cautionary tale, a woman who could have been more. If only she hadn't wanted too much, but I was far from finished. Because if the crown wouldn't give me purpose, I would find it elsewhere, even if it cost me everything. By the time the world turned to the 1980s, I had learned something ugly. You can be born in a palace and still die of loneliness. My days blurred into a cycle of appearances, small talk, and red carpets that felt more like traps than triumphs. I was always on, always present, and yet never allowed to be real. What they don't tell you about royalty is how isolating it is. Every room has a watcher. Every moment has a critic. You cannot weep without scandal. You cannot breathe without permission. And when you make a mistake, or worse, when you don't, the world turns you into a character they can sell. I was no longer Margaret, the girl who loved jazz records and red lipstick. I was a tabloid queen. The press followed my every misstep. They printed lies, speculated on my weight, my health, my relationships. They mocked my fashion, dissected my expressions, and tracked the color of my cocktails like it was a national crisis. Even the family, the one I was born to serve, began to grow colder. Elizabeth had her role stable, reserved, adored. She had duty, power, and the adoration of the Commonwealth. And me, I was the contrast, the chaos, the sister whose shadow lengthened even in sunlight. The younger royals came next. Charles and Diana, beautiful, tragic, mythic. Suddenly, I wasn't even the scandal anymore. I was irrelevant, invisible. And then came the illnesses, the smoking, the drinking, the heartbreak. It all caught up with me, like a long-awaited debt collector. First it was a lung operation, then pneumonia, then strokes that stole parts of my body without warning. Each time I was hospitalized, the headlines danced. Princess Margaret's health crisis, frail and forgotten. The royal rebel's final fall. I read them while lying in bed, unable to move the right side of my face, my vision blurred, my breath shallow. My body was a crumbling monument, and still they demanded I smile for cameras. You want to know betrayal? Betrayal is not being abandoned by enemies, it's being discarded by the world you spent your whole life trying to belong to. Even my friends began to thin out. Not because they didn't love me, but because it was exhausting to orbit someone forever labeled a liability. They said I was difficult, but I wasn't. I was just tired of pretending. Tired of holding in the screen. When I retreated to Mystique, the island became my sanctuary. A place where no one called me Your Highness, where I could wear caftans and listen to Calypso and Cyprum without judgment. It was there, among the salt air and crushing waves, that I remembered what it was to feel joy, if only for a moment. But the truth is, I was dying, not just from strokes or illness, but from neglect, from invisibility, from being a woman the world punished for refusing to bow to a life she never asked for. I never imagined the end would come in silence. Not for me. All my life, there had been noise. Cameras clicking, headlines spinning, critics chattering, champagne glasses clinking. But the last stretch, it was quiet, too quiet. The final years were carved from shadows. After my third stroke, half of my body refused to obey me. I watched my reflection in the mirror. The same mirror that once showed a young, vibrant princess dancing barefoot in ballrooms, and saw a woman I didn't recognize. I had spent decades defying them all, the crown, the church, the press, the protocol. I had broken rules, and they had broken me in return. Now I sat in my apartment at Kensington Palace, surrounded by trinkets of a life too big to fit in memory, and wondered what it had all been for. I thought about Elizabeth. I thought about that moment, decades ago, when she asked me if I could really live a quiet life. When she made me choose between love and royalty. It was never really a choice. It was a verdict. We never spoke of it again. We never needed to. But it lived in every glance, every silence, every headline that drove a deeper wedge between us. She was the monarch. I was the cautionary tale. But I never stopped loving her. Not for one day. I just wanted her to love me back without conditions, without shame, without royal correctness. I thought about my children. I had tried to shield them from this life, But how do you protect someone from a legacy written in blood and gold? I thought about Townsend, even near the end, when my mind wandered and my body failed. His name still echoed in my chest like a heartbeat I never quite forgot. We were both betrayed, not by each other, but by a system that put image above love. And I thought about you, the public. You who loved me one moment, damned me the next. You who called me rebellious, spoiled, scandalous, tragic. You never knew me. Not really, but maybe you wanted to. Maybe you saw in me what I saw in myself. Someone trapped between duty and desire. Someone who wanted more than just a title and a tiara. Someone who wanted to feel real. In the last weeks, I refused all the royal dramatics. No photographers, no corporates, just my caretakers, my dogs, my silence. I knew when the end came, there wouldn't be a fairy tale. There would just be a funeral, and yet, despite it all, I didn't regret my life, because even in the coldest rooms of the palace, I had burned. I had danced, I had fallen in love, I had dared to want more. And in a family where everyone learned to dim their flame for the sake of duty, I let mine roar, even if it scorched everything it touched. I was Margaret Rose Windsor. I was the crown's forgotten flame, and I was never meant to be quiet. They said I was a cautionary tale. They said I was vain, scandalous, dramatic, spoiled, and lost. They reduced a lifetime of laughter and heartbreak into a string of tabloid headlines, old documentaries, and footnotes beneath Elizabeth's towering reign. But what they never asked was, why did I become that way? Let me answer that now, because this is the only place I can speak freely. From beyond the page, beyond the crown, beyond the silence they demanded of me for 70 years, I was raised to be visible but not heard. From the time I was a little girl, I knew my role: sparkle, smile, step aside. I was born to serve a monarch I once called Lilibet, and though we shared a womb of royal duty, she wore the crown, while I wore the expectations of everything she could not be. When my sister became queen, I didn't become free. I became trapped in the golden cage of public fascination and institutional irrelevance. I was too royal to live like the rest of you, but not royal enough to matter, so I carved out my own existence. I laughed louder, smoked longer, danced harder, loved recklessly, and yes, sometimes destroyed things in the fire of my own defiance. But what else could I do? My choices were filtered through a microscope of scrutiny that no man in the palace ever endured. When Philip misstepped, they called him brash. When I fell in love, they called me immoral. There's a word they used for women like me. Difficult, but I was never difficult. I was alive. I refused to be a symbol. I wanted to be a woman. That was my crime. I dared to feel, to grieve, to yearn. I dared to fall in love with a man my country told me was beneath me. I dared to marry one who was the wrong kind of wild. I dared to divorce when the monarchy still whispered behind closed doors and smiled for photo ops. I dared to exist outside their script. History will say I lived in luxury. But let me tell you this. A palace can be the loneliest place in the world. No amount of velvet cushions, gilded mirrors, or diamond tiaras can fill the space where choice should live. I had rooms full of admirers, but very few who truly understood me. Except perhaps the ones I wasn't allowed to love. In my final days, when the royal obligations faded and the paparazzi lost interest, I began to reflect, not just on the choices I made, but on the role I played in a system that never really saw me. I saw what Elizabeth carried. I saw the loneliness in her too, and though we rarely said it aloud, we were sisters in solitude, to women bound by birth and burden. She bore the weight of a crown. I bore the weight of wanting more. I don't know how history will judge me. Maybe they'll call me a rebel. Maybe they'll call me a failure. Maybe they'll dismiss me as a royal embarrassment who never quite lived up to her promise. But if even one of you remembers me not as Her Royal Highness, not as the Princess of Scandal, but as a woman who tried, who dared to love and live and lose and burn brighter than she was allowed, then I've left something behind that matters, because I was never just Margaret. I was the reflection the crown didn't want to see. And now that I'm gone, I hope someone else looks in that mirror and finally speaks. If this story moved you or revealed a side of royalty you never knew, please like, comment, and share it. There are thousands of stories buried beneath crowns and scepters, and on this channel, we dig deep to bring them to light. Subscribe for more untold histories, betrayals, and legacies left in the shadows.